everybody to this fourth Connecta meeting organized by the University of Lleida. And once again, we meet to listen to the proceedings of doctoral research. And today we close the cycle before the roundtable of the 13th January. And we will travel to the north of Spain to listen to Alicia Martín, which is a PhD student in medieval history at the University of Salamanca and member of the ATAM, his research group, and the S-Micro research project, which is titled The Scenarios of Micropolitics, Collective Action, Local Societies, and Encompassing Power. Today, she will talk about territorial conflicts and local identities in early medieval northern Iberia, a subject in which she is a really specialist. So, Alicia, I'm very pleased to give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon, and well, thanks for the presentation, and also to persons who are gathered here for your presence. And also, even though he's not here as it's recorded, I like also to thank Rogerio very much for inviting me to participate in this seminar series. Well, first of all, I must warn that I'm not going to use slides to support my presentation. I'm really sorry, but I rather prefer to concentrate myself on reading my paper as correctly and relaxed as possible. Let's start. Well, as has been said, the title of my talk this afternoon is Territorial Conflicts and Local Identities in Early Medieval Northern Iberia, a central topic of the PhD thesis I'm working on, in which I try to study the influence of territorial conflicts in the construction, reproduction, and change of the identities and social dynamics of the communities in the north of the Iberian Peninsula during the early Middle Ages. Specifically, I focus on the chronological period between the 9th and 11th centuries and on a geographical framework that includes, with comparative depth, areas of both the Kingdom of Leon and the Catalan counties. Before moving on to my presentation of the subject itself, given the international nature of this seminar, I believe that it's necessary to make two brief notes on the reality of Iberia in this period and on the historiography that has studied it. The Islamic conquest of 711 marked the end of the Visigothic kingdom of Toledo, giving rise to a fragmented political reality. A large part of the peninsula came under the rule of Al-Andalus, but in the north, however, its control took root to a lesser extent. In the northwest, from the mid-8th century onwards, there is no evidence of political control by any central authority. In this area, new political structures began to form around small centers, which in later centuries, through complex processes of assertion of authority and territorial expansion, will become the kingdoms of Asturias, Leon, and Pamplona. The northeast, for its part, was included in the Carolingian political sphere at the end of the 8th century in the form of counties that in practice acted quite autonomously. Both in the east and in the west, the capacity for action of these powers was quite limited, especially and largely conditioned by the power gains of the aristocracies and large ecclesiastical institutions. All this combined with resilient local societies, which had remained small scale and with full capacity to organize themselves and manage their resources. During these centuries, all these scales came more and more into contact with each other, often giving rise to conflicts. If the early medieval reality of the Iberian Peninsula was fragmentary, the historiography that has approached has been knowledge. So, well, the best way to introduce this subject is through the article Towards a Transregional Approach to Early Medieval Iberia, authored by many scholars that you will find in the document attached when it will arrive with the mail. And this article offers a broad overview of the subject. This article is the result of an initiative which is aimed at a comparative and more integrative approach to the peninsular reality. And the trend has not been towards studies concerned with interrogating sources from different origins on common problems. And this extends to research on justice and conflict, which have tended to consider sources from the Northwest and the Northeast too different from each other to be studied together. Having said all this, I will now concentrate on today's topic, starting with the presentation of a document. In 1063, the abbot of the monastery of Telanova, Arian, brought before the king a lawsuit against the inhabitants of the villages of Solbeira and Scornavois for the property of these two villages, as well as for those of Murauthos, Thos, and Lobaces. At the beginning of the judicial narration, when the opposing parties are introduced, the Ominas of Limia are identified as the grandchildren of Luparia Taguilaz, Aloito Fernandez, and Vimara Fernandez, and the Ominas of Scornavois as Vimara Gaudiz and Cemal Siginit with their people. The monks of Telanova said that the dispute villages had belonged to the monastery since the time of Alfonso and Count Menendo González, and that these men owed them service. For their part, the inhabitants of the villages claimed that these lands were of their property and that they did not depend on the monastery. Once the case was brought before the king, he sent one of his troops to the dispute area to continue the proceedings. There, in the church of San Pedro de la Roa, next to the said village, 5 witnesses presented by the monastery were sworn. These witnesses list Celanova's possessions in the said villas, as well as some spaces that belonged to other individuals and were outside his domain, explaining the whole series of transactions to which these lands had been subject. After this, the inhabitants of this village seemed to be unable to present any kind of evidence to prove their argument and accept the judgment in favor of Celanova. When it comes to recognizing the truth of the monastery, the mention of the people who made up the groups of settlers presented at the beginning of the document becomes much more clear. And it's like that we can know with greater precision who the grandchildren of Luparia Taguilaz and Aloito Fernandez will be. Several men identified by name and patronymic who represent themselves and also their wives and other relatives. This document, which comes from the cartulary of Telanova, may inspire us with many questions. For example, what does really Omnes de means? Who are the local individuals who appear in the document? What unites these people? And what differentiates them from some of the other subjects mentioned? What kind of relationship will there be between Semal Seguini, the last of the characters named, and his people? What are the long-term consequences of the dispute? We will be able to answer some of these questions. Other, including the identity of the individuals, not. Even though it's an example of the way in which local groups appear in court and of the actors who managed to impose their reasons, condition and the understanding of the post-conflict space, two of the aspects that we will try to address throughout this presentation. But very briefly, before turning to the main points of the paper, I should explain two of the main theoretical foundations at the basis of my research, which give meaning to some of what I'm going to say next. Firstly, as evidenced by extensive social research, territoriality is a central aspect of human identity. Is a social construct resulting from the attempt of an individual or group to assert influence or control over people, phenomena, and relationships by delimiting and asserting control over a geographical area. Territory is thus a geographical expression of power. All human societies produce their own notions of territoriality, and even several of them can coexist in the same space. Early medieval local societies are no exception to this principle. And we can see that they were capable of creating territorial models and giving some symbolic meaning to the space they consider and claim as their own. The second principle has to do with conflict, which rather than representing a pathology of society, is a recurrent element in social relationships and plays a fundamental role in their structuring. Their resolution may result in the consolidation of previously established discourses on space and social relationships, but also in changes to them, or directly in the emergence of new interests or in a new perception of space. These effects will be visible in this scenario that emerge with the reestablishment of normality after the end of the dispute, a normality that, however, will be necessarily different from the pre-conflict situation. With all this clear, let's turn to the first of the issues I would like to discuss today, which we can label local groups before the court. Local groups appear mostly in two ways in the documentation of disputes. Either as parties involved in the conflict, most often in confrontation with non-collective and high-status actors, or as witnesses. As in the example from the Celanova Cartulari we saw earlier, although in a few cases the groups appear simple as a long side of citation of individuals, more usually are preceded or even replaced in the judicial narrative by terms such as homines de or habitantes de, which refer to the locality from which these people come, but without having to assume that all the individuals settled there are included, nor due to other characteristic terms, sometimes also associated with a locality, such as concilium and collatio. These two words are used to describe meetings or assemblies, which could be secular, held in a local space, or convened for various matters, including the resolution of disputes. However, these terms are not without their problems. Firstly, there are doubts as to how effective they are in accurately representing social reality. And they may be no more than labels created by the producer of the documents, sometimes centuries after the events took place. in an attempt to describe fluid societies that are difficult to characterize. Moreover, their use was not always consistent, and they tell us little about the composition of these groups, their internal dynamics, or their relatively stability. What is clear is that we will not be dealing with overly institutionalized realities, and that the groups could overlap. They will not be exclusive and could not integrate all the members of a place. They could also appear and disappear over time together with the interest that brought them together, which does not invalidate their capacity to put collective action into practice, the element that truly allows us to speak of local or peasant communities. On the other hand, as mentioned before, local groups appear also in the documentation as witnesses. The oral inquiry was a method widely used by medieval courts of justice to find the evidence and arguments necessary to settle disputes on the basis of the first-hand information provided by the persons questioned. They are used in all kinds of disputes, and these local witnesses appear both in cases where a high-status actor needs to demonstrate his reasons, as well as in cases where other local groups, or his own group, need support in its claim. And their involvement is highly symbolic, as it defines their position in clientelistic and power relations. Unfortunately, very often, the list of witnesses consists only of a simple enumeration of names, which make it very difficult to know who they are and the logic that leads them to testify before the court. The number of these witnesses varies. They are usually less than a dozen, but there are some cases in which many more of them appear. These cases are also recorded in the Northwest, but some of the most spectacular and famous are found among the Catalan documentation. They are the trials of Vilamacolum in 915, in which the inhabitants of this village were required to serve the city of Empúries on the count, but they presented 32 witnesses, with which they managed to demonstrate that they were exempt from doing so, the servicium, or that of the same year in which the Abbess Emma of San Joan de los Abadeses was demanded the service of the inhabitants of the surrounding villages. In response, the population of these villages, hundreds of individuals from around 20 different places, was mobilized to confirm that their village, lands and houses belonged to the monastery, and that they owed servitium only to the monastery. Well, there is also another example, but without all the documents, I think it's better if I go on and with the text. Well, there is another important aspect to take into consideration when analyzing the way in which local communities appear before the courts, which is the issue of representation. It does not occur in all cases, but it's a relatively diffuse practice that we find both in those disputes in which the groups are one of the parties to the conflict and also when they are witnesses. If we look at the cases in which the group is one of the conflicting parties, we find diversity of representatives. In some cases, such as in a case of that came from Sagun of the year 1091, we find an individual of high status representing a community. On this particular occasion is the Count Martín Flynez, who represents the inhabitants of Villavicencio. These cases speak to us of relationships of a different nature established at the supralocal level. However, for our more microanalytical interest, we also have some cases in which representation is a local affair. Here I'm going to talk again about the Catalan case dating from the year 983, in which the monastery of Santa Maria de Ripoll claims ownership of the allodium comprising the two villages from the inhabitants of Lluís and Coscorio. The neighbors of these villas are mentioned by name, but they are also represented by the mandatarius Wistrimir, a character who is part of these communities, because it's very clear that the action that the rest must take in relation to the property, which they end up losing in favor of the monastery, must also be taken by him. Unfortunately, we do not have more data that could give more depth to the figure of Wistrimir. So we do not know the reason that leads to this character being placed at the head of the group. But just as in other situations, it's not entirely clear that the representative is part of the group represented. In this case, in my opinion, it's more than clear that this is the case. I could give more examples, and other occasions we are dealing with figures who are better understood as representatives because they are local notables, as in the case of Infanzones, but I don't want to go for too long, perhaps in the debate. As far as witness representation is concerned, we have already seen an example above and the difficulties involved in identifying who the witnesses are, but there are certain dynamics operating within the communities that create obvious differences, such as age, which has an impact on the performance of certain functions, such as representing the local group as a witness. There are numerous occasions in which people are required to be not only suitable and legitimate to swear, but also noble and elderly, and they have been extensively studied. On other occasions, just as in the case of San Joan de les Abadeses, the witnesses were clearly identified with their respective places of residence. And this also happens with witnesses representing their communities, as occurs, for example, in a document from the Tumbo de Sobrado, the cartulary of Sobrado, which at the end of the 10th century, a dispute broke out between the bishops of Lugo and Iberia over the dependence of the men of various places in the valley of Presas, where the monastery of Sobrado is located. Due to various problems, the conflict dragged on over time and went through many phases, among which there was an oath taken by several people representing their respective communities, being clearly identified by name and by the locality on behalf of which they took the oath. Well, I'm going to quickly address now the second aspect I wanted to deal with today, which is the post-dispute scenario, the implications of conflict in the local arena. We have already said in the theoretical part that the resolution of a conflict implies an inevitable mutation to a greater or lesser degree in one form or another, of the pre-dispute conditions. However, one of the limitations of the documentary evidence that has come down to us and that we have to our disposal is that it does not normally allow us to track changes over time. It's therefore extremely fortunate. So we are extremely fortunate when we find a few documents that are related. Well, when the handout I wanted to share with you today will arrive to you, well, I have included a documentary dossier widely known and studied, which is that of the area of Verín in the southeast of the current province of Ourense, where there are several conflicts around the middle of the 10th century over the boundaries of the villages in that area. But in this our case is quite complicated, complex, in order to present it without a test. So I'm going to focus on the second pair of documents I was thinking to present to you, because well, I think they are more simple. They are two cases related, which occur in 944 and 955. And in the first, the monks of the monastery of San Andres de Pardomino are confronted in court by the inhabitants of several nearby village places because they had transgressed the limits of the monastery's lands for the second time. Fact, in the test, we find that this problem had occurred some time before and had been resolved by reinstating remarking the limits. But once again, they have go through it. So they are again before the court. The matter seems to have ended there, but in 955 we find the same actors again, this time in a document in which the inhabitants of the villages undertook to plough the mountain within the limits they had set some time before, and to hand over part of the goods produced there to the monastery. We are therefore faced with a case that allows us to observe how a monastery managed over time, and not without effort and contestation from the local communities, to impose its dominion over the territory, thereby changing the way the space is exploited and imposing new social relations around it. The case described is in the second judicial document is comparable to many others, in which, after a semblance of compromise and negotiation, local communities are subjected to some kind of servitude. This is a phenomenon found in both study areas. However, I will not want to give the impression that local groups are never able to assert their dominion through these disputes. So I will mention another document, in this case from Cornellà de Llobregat, in the year 1001, in which the inhabitants of the town managed to prove the public nature of some roads that some individuals named Pere and Enrique had appropriated. Well, finally, just as in the previous section, we ask about individual action within the local groups through the task of representation, it's also necessary to discuss what participation in disputes might be possible on a personal level for some individuals in the localities. Of course, one of the problems is that the vast majority of people from local groups rarely appear in the documentation. It's quite normal that we have many of them in conflict, and that is the only news that we have about them. But even so, we can in some cases glimpse positive consequences for some individuals from these peasant communities. This is the case of a document from the diplomatic collection of Sagun, which in 1071 refers to a conflict when the Bishop of León appears in Begamian to consecrate the church that the presbyter Fernando, and with him the whole collatio, that is the persons linked to that church, had built. The bishop refused to perform the consecration unless the laity handed it over to the presbyter, trying to prevent them from turning it into their own property. In the end, they do so, and the bishop consecrates the church without any problem. Therefore, the ecclesiastical structure, which is trying to impose itself in the area, creating a parish system at the time, is certainly strengthened by the whole case. But at the local level, the person who will come to control the church is the priest Fernando, who was already a prominent person in the locality. But after this, he's clearly strengthened. An effect that is not unique to this case either, as there are some details in other documents that make us think that the characters who were already prominent at the local level somehow understand the judicial arena as yet another sphere in which to highlight their relevance and at the same time emerge strength from the processes. In short and very briefly, I believe that two key ideas can be drawn from this presentation. Firstly, that the reality of the local societies of the north of the Iberian Peninsula in the early medieval centuries is certainly complex. They are by no means, the local communities, are no homogeneous entities, and most of the labels used in the documentation to define their dynamics are restrictive. The conflicts in which they are immersed are very diverse from one another, as well as their solutions and effects. But in general, we can accept that the groups which are very fluid in time and non-exclusive have the capacity to organize themselves towards collective action, and, among other things, are defending them before the courts. And secondly, although it has long been considered that the documentation from the northwest and northeast of the peninsula was too diverse for comparison, this is not the case. Without denying the particularities of each of them, the differences that also exist between the collection of these two macro regions and that have not prevented us from being treat them together, they illustrate in many cases similar processes at different times and at different speeds, but a common form of research can be applied to them. And that is all. Thank you very much for hearing me patiently, and well, I'm so sorry for not being able to give you the documents.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alicia, for your paper and for your presentation, as rich as always. You have reviewed some of the main problems linked. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, because I have my screen completely black. I don't know why. I was saying that you have reviewed some of the main problems linked to the exercise of justice, especially from the point of view of its social articulation, with special attention to the participants in the placita, from Galicia to Leon and onwards. Anyone have any questions? Questions on the ways in which?
Well, I have.
Okay,
I
please,
general
Sergi.
question that goes to the final and not specifically to the topic you have treated, but to the general scope and problem you were treating, which is the ability to compare the documentation in Northeast and Northwest Iberia. And as working in a previous period to what you mainly are studying here, my question goes that if you find it more similar in earlier periods, or there is a transformation toward a convergence, that there's, or you cannot really assess directly in that context, and you have to just acknowledge that there is a very diverse area, and you cannot really trace big groups and big periods, and you have to go case by case scenario to really understand that.
Well, thank you very much for this question. It's really, really important and interesting. I think, as I said at the end, the important thing is to comprise this, that the processes we see are similar, but the time at which happen are different, and also the speed. So in that sense, for example, we see this big conflicts between, for example, monastery institution or also aristocratic persons and communities in Catalonia really early in the 10th. Meanwhile, we must wait some almost a century to see something similar, or half a century to see something similar in the north west part of the peninsula. Then, for example, what we see in the 11th in Catalonia, we don't see as much as conflicts between communities and these powers. These big conflicts are well, we don't find it, and it could seem that there are peaceful or a scenario, or that the situation is being it's more stable. But when we go to the other part, we are seeing that type of conflict that we saw there before. So I think we should be aware of this, but even though I think it's possible to compare this, obviously taking into account always the chronology. There are obviously also different periods with different tendencies, I don't know, dynamics or trends, but also into these macro regions. It also changed from, for example, what we see in Leon or what we see in Galicia. In Galicia, for example, we can find these big conflicts between communities or local groups, and in aristocrats or monasteries a little bit earlier than we see this in Leon. So we must, I don't know how to say, we must play this game of looking. I think it's possible to look in a comprehensive way, but taking into account also the differences. I don't know if I
Yes.
answered you.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Sergi. There are other questions, critics. Okay, I have one, if you want.
Question or critic?
No, I have just a question. You have mentioned the concilia in your paper. So the royal council in Iberia, in medieval Iberia, in early medieval Iberia, basically, because in the late Middle Ages, the councils are very, very different. But in the early Middle Ages, in Iberian early Middle Ages, the council is something very ambiguous and difficult to characterize, no? The written sources give almost nothing, no clue as to what they are defining when they define something like a council. So what do you think about this word, this label, council? What is your view on it? It has an institutional characterization, a social one, is only a space of political representation for the crowd, which is living within those landscapes. Tell us more.
Well, it's quite difficult.
Yeah, I know.
You know it perfectly. So I think it's necessary to first of all make a difference between that concilia in which we find bishops or the king, and those other concilia in which we can find other actors of less less status. My opinion, well, I'm not so far from what the historiography has said over the last years. No, well, as I said, they are labels that probably don't describe really accurately the reality, which is much more complex. It's possible that when we are seeing this concilia, we have an arena of representation much of the times. But I think especially in the cases in which are assemblies of low status, maybe they are not really much institutionalized. In the cases in which we find bishops or we find abbots, we find kings, I think in that cases, because of the fact that the persons that are mentioned much of the time are always the same, I think it's also an area of representation, but in that case it could be more stable in the time. I mean, in some way more institutionalized, but I can say much more because, well, the documents don't describe it very much.
No, not at all. they
Not
don't
at all.
describe. They cite the councils and say the council is appointed, or the witnesses of the council, etc. But we don't know nothing about that.
Yes,
Okay, there are any questions? if there are no questions, we say thanks again to Alicia for his paper on these complicated issues of Northern Iberian justice and crowds and witnesses in early medieval Galicia and Leon. And I want to invite you for the final appointment of this turn of Connecta, the 5th Connecta, which will be delivered as a round table on 30th January. And so you are pleased to participate to that kind of appointment in which the 4th participants will be very pleased if you will connect with us to enjoy the roundtable in which we will discuss about the 4th papers presented in these days, in this autumn and so winter days. Thank you very much, and see you as soon as the 30th of January. Bye.
I thank you.